right, Robby, what's on your radar today?
Well, now that Minnesota Governor Tim Walz has become Vice President Kamala Harris's running mate, it is ostensibly time for the media to scrutinize his record and past statements. Emphasis on ostensibly. To say that the mainstream coverage of Walz has been fawning thus far would be quite the understatement. The New York Times has described him as, quote, a one-man rejoinder to the idea that the Democrats are the party of the cultural and coastal elite. It's a nice thing to say about someone. The Atlantic has merrily aided widespread media efforts to portray Walz as lovable, folksy, a paternal figure, writing that dad is on the ballot. It's dad, 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 everyone calling him dad. CNN has proclaimed the Harris-Walz team as an antidote to Trump's American carnage. Kamala Harris and Tim Walz want to make America joyful again. That's CNN's Stephen Collinson, an analyst. The task of scrutinizing Walz will clearly fall to other interested parties. See my radar from yesterday on Walz's COVID-era policies, which were, in my view, tyrannical and wrong. And so alternative and contrarian media is mostly involved in the efforts to find Walz's weaknesses. Conservatives on social media did manage to dig up an old clip of Walz making an alarming and false claim. He said, quote, there's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation and hate speech, especially around our democracy. That's the quote. Walz is wrong, of course. The First Amendment, which vigorously protects Americans' free speech rights, does not distinguish between good information and misinformation. Moreover, so-called hate speech, an arbitrary category, is as different people find different sorts of speech to be hateful. It's quite obviously protected speech, protected from government interference. Now, that clip of Walz, the sentence I read, is from a clip that is only 8 seconds long, and I'm always wary of taking people out of context. So I went looking for the rest of the clip, was able to find it online and track it down, and so we're going to play that now. Here it is.
Yeah, years ago, it was the little things, telling people to vote the day after the election. And, you know, we kind of brushed them off. Now we know it's intimidation at the ballot box. Mm-hmm. It's undermining the idea that mail-in ballots aren't legal. I think we need to push back on this. There's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy. Tell the truth where the voting places are, who can vote, who's able to be there. And watching some states continue to weaken the protections around the ballot, I think, is what inspiring us to lean into this. Again, all we're asking is to make it as easy and simple as possible to exercise their right to vote and participate in our democracy. And I'm in 100% agreement with you. That makes it so that more people are there. You get more opinions brought in. And I think it tempers that extremes that we get.
That was Walz's response to a question from MSNBC about trying to trick people into voting or voting incorrectly. Now, I'm going to read it again just so there's no misunderstanding. I transcribed what he said, and he said years ago it was the little things telling people to vote the day after the election, and we kind of brushed them off. Nowadays, we know it's intimidation at the ballot box. It's undermining the idea that mail-in ballots aren't legal. I think we need to push back on this. There's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation and hate speech, especially around our democracy. Tell the truth where the voting places are, who can vote, who's able to be there. Watching some states continue to weaken this protection around the ballot are, I think, what's inspiring us to lean into this again. What we're all asking is to make it easy and simple to exercise our right to vote and participate in our democracy, end quote. Okay, suffice it to say, the surrounding context does not greatly improve the accuracy of Walz's remark. It's unfortunately true that false statements about the time, place, and manner of voting in U.S. elections have occasionally been criminalized. For instance, the Justice Department prosecuted a man named Douglas Mackey for making jokes online encouraging Democrats to vote over the phone. Ha ha. Now, the authorities cited an obscure law from 1870 that was aimed at protecting the Ku Klux Klan, preventing the Ku Klux Klan from threatening black voters away from the polls. The Volokh conspiracy's Eugene Volokh, a law professor, was disturbed by the government's actions and wrote that the authorities were entering murky territory. Now, if Walz had said that deliberately misinforming specific people about how and when to vote can be considered a criminal action under certain circumstances, then yes, he would have been on solid ground. But he was obviously making a much more general claim about spreading so-called election-related misinformation. Lumping in hate speech only weakens the claim even further. The Supreme Court has held Labeling speech as hateful does not render it unsayable. Indeed, the First Amendment is specifically designed to protect speech in the event that government authorities attempt to suppress it on such grounds as it being deemed hateful. As Justice Samuel Alito wrote in his opinion on behalf of a unanimous court in the case of Mattel versus Tom, speech that demeans on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, religion, age, disability, or any other similar ground is hateful, but the proudest boast of our free speech jurisprudence is that we protect the freedom to express the thought that we hate. Now, Walz is hardly the first political figure to make this mistake. High-level government and media actors who ought to know better frequently suggest that bad, wrong, and hateful speech is illegal. Here was Democratic Senator Ben Carden at a congressional hearing 2 years ago.
If you espouse hate, if you espouse violence, you're not protected under the First Amendment. So I think we can be more aggressive in the way that we handle that type of use of the internet. We know that Europe has done things. I think we have to learn from each other.
Whew. Once again, that line about hate speech is dead wrong. But in a way, it's Walz's invocation of the dreaded specter of misinformation that's especially concerning to me, given the current moral panic around the concept. As I've previously explained, an ever-expanding web of academic departments, quasi-governmental organizations, media watchdog groups, and publicly funded nonprofits have made it their business to police so-called misinformation on social media. Federal bureaucrats have encouraged content moderators to suppress speech, including jokes about elections. Government authorities frequently act as if they have the power to compel Americans to stop saying contrarian and satirical things about a range of political topics. Sadly, they've often gotten away with it. This is why Walz's misunderstanding about misinformation is so important. With the Supreme Court having declined recently, unfortunately, to prohibit federal agencies from job-owning social media companies, the next administration will have a relatively free hand to escalate the government's pressure campaign on disinfo. It's not an encouraging sign to me that the would-be VP is fundamentally mistaken on a vital tenet of the U.S.'s free speech tradition. Maybe Dad should learn something about the First Amendment.
So, Robby, you agree that the First Amendment protects speech with the exception of the precedent upheld by the Supreme Court multiple times, that unless there's clear and present danger, and that doctrine holding that states could only restrict speech that, quote, is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action.
Right. There are a couple recognized exceptions to free speech, including the ones you just laid out: incitement to violence, libel, slander, etc. These are very, very narrowly crafted exceptions. They do not generally apply to misinformation or hate speech.
Right. And so Walz's direct statement was that there is no guarantee that hateful speech is protected, right? That's what you quoted him saying.
Yeah, but there is a guarantee that hateful speech is protected.
Not if that
slanderous
speech is determined to have a clear and present danger, right?
No, it has to be violent speech, not just hateful speech. You could say something hateful about someone's religion or their appearance or their family. You have to threaten violence, and you have to threaten it specifically, like, this is when I am going to commit the violence. You have to say, we should go out and kill this person at this time, and there has to be a reasonable expectation that it's a serious threat, not just a vague pronouncement to violence or lawless action. If it is specific enough, it can be in violation of, it can be a crime.
Yeah, we're on the same page about that. But do you agree that sometimes hateful speech is violent?
Yes.
So
sometimes, yes.
What Walz said is then accurate in a legal sense, right?
No,
that there's no
it's absolutely
guarantee
inaccurate.
That hate speech is protected, because sometimes, as you just said, hate speech is violent, and that is what is not protected under the Supreme Court.
If he had said hate speech is vigorously protected by the First Amendment unless your hateful speech is a call to imminent lawless action and violence, then he would have been correct. But he said hate speech itself. What he suggested was that because it is hateful, it is not protected, or because it is misinformation, it is not protected. And you can be wrong. You can be hateful. Your speech is protected by the First Amendment. That's exactly what the First Amendment does protect. And again, it's important because federal agents have been trying to get what they've deemed misinformation, and oftentimes I don't even think it's misinformation, suppressed widely on social media. They've been forcing the companies to do that.
But also, after Donald Trump's attempted assassination, you had people like his own son posting on X and a lot of conservative commentators saying that this was an act of violence incited by the hateful speech of Democrats and the left.
That's a BS.
Right.
That's total BS. I said it was BS. I said it at the time.
So
totally against that.
I'm just demonstrating it doesn't just come from the left when this happens,
No,
Robby.
I didn't make that claim.
I think it's important to be very specific about what Walz said. Speech that demeans on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, religion, age, disability, or any other similar ground is hateful. But the proudest boast of our free speech jurisprudence is that we protect the freedom to express the thought that we hate.
That's the quote from Alito. That's the Supreme Court. Yeah.
Yes. So, you are free to express the thought that you hate, but sometimes when you say hateful things, you are also saying violent things. Therefore, Walz's statement that there's no guarantee of protection doesn't apply to all hate speech. It's not that there is a guarantee that it's protected. There's just no guarantee when you say certain things, because if they are violent, if they present a clear and present danger determined by a court, they're not guaranteed to be protected.
Right, but what makes it unprotected is not that it's hateful, but that it's violent. The hate part is a distraction. And it's an important one
sometimes
because
hateful
people...
speech is violent, Robby.
And sometimes non-hateful speech is violent. Like,
exactly, that's why there's no guarantee.
Violence. Right, but...
He didn't say every time you say something hateful, you're going to get in trouble with the law, did he?
He said hateful speech is not protected, and it is. And he's
That's
not the first person to say that.
That is
As
not
I
his
played Ben
words,
Carden saying
Robby.
that. It is something frequently said by people, by
but not
Democratic
by
political
Walz,
figures.
which is what you made this radar.
That's exactly what he said. That's word for word what he said.
No, he said there is no guarantee. He did not say every time you say something hateful,
he said there's no
it is against
guarantee
the law.
for hateful speech.
To
There
be
is a guarantee
protected.
for hateful speech.
There's no guarantee for hateful speech to be protected because sometimes hateful speech presents a clear and present danger, which is the Supreme Court precedent of free speech that is not protected.
Then would you say it's accurate to say there's no guarantee that political speech is protected?
Right, because sometimes political speech is violent and hateful and presents a clear and present danger. If you are inciting a mob of violence and you're like, but this is my political position, that is not protected under the Constitution of the United States.
Right, for those clarifying reasons. But the fact that it would be wrong to say political speech is not protected. It would be wrong to say religious speech is not protected. It would be wrong to say dissent is not protected. Those things are all protected unless they satisfy some extremely narrow criteria, like very, very narrow criteria that they have evolved into violent action. So to imply that speech is impermissible because it's hateful or because it's misinformation misses, in my view, the entire point of the First Amendment. Walz is not at all alone in committing this error, but it is an error, and it reflects bad judgment given that if he and Kamala win, they'll be in charge of a massive federal bureaucracy that has made its mission to destroy dissenting and contrarian opinions online in the last however many years. And we need someone who understands the limits of, I'm not the only one making a big deal about this. I saw Glenn Greenwald, for instance, tweeted out this clip and said that Walz is totally wrong, and I can pull up exactly what he said, but again, Glenn was concerned and said this is a one of the most esteemed First Amendment free speech expert journalists was worried by this statement and thought it was, here I found out, he says, Tim Walz falsely believes the free speech guarantee doesn't include what he considers to be misinformation or hate speech, will bother almost no Dem supporters since the vast majority of them want the state to be empowered to censor dissent. So this is bad, and I'm calling people's attention to it, in my view.
Just because Glenn Greenwald said it doesn't mean it's true. Constitutional lawyers uphold the president. The Supreme Court has written it in every decision they've had to uphold the clear and present danger exception. And to split hairs and try and find these little things.
I'm not splitting hairs. You're splitting hairs to find a way to make it defensible when it's not.
It is defensible.
It's absolutely
There is not a
It's
guarantee
totally wrong.
to free speech on misinformation and hate speech
Yes,
because
there is.
those two things can present a clear and present danger.
Well, then that's just like saying there's not a guarantee to free speech, period.
No, there's an exception, and it's when there's a clear and present danger. misinformation, and hate speech.
Okay, so
can
you'd say
present
there's
clear
no
and
protection
present
for free
danger.
speech. So you would say there's no guarantee that speech is protected. You would make that statement.
There is no guarantee that speech is protected if it presents a clear and present danger. That is the
He
precedent
didn't
upheld
say
by the
that.
Supreme
He didn't
Court.
add those little.
He said there's no guarantee.
Well, right, but there is a
To
guarantee that
specifically
speech that is hateful is-
misinformation and
All right,
hate
we're just
speech,
going-
which is the kind of speech that can present
I think we're
a
not
clear and present
disagreeing on the
danger.
underlying issue because there's no disagreement.
It's just that I
very
don't
clearly
think Walz
adjudicated.
believes
You're
what
just
you
trying
think Walz
to-
believes.
I think he absolutely does. Well, I don't know what he believes. I just know what he said, and what he said was inaccurate, but
I think you're reading a lot into what he said, though, Robby.
okay. You guys let me know what you think about this. More Rising right after this.